Good evening. According to my Apple Watch, the clock just ticked 5:30, so I think we'll get started. Welcome to all of you. This is the 5th program of our series for the summer, our 33rd year. And you know that we're a nonprofit and we welcome your contributions. And we try to surprise you. Every week there's a different bowl up here. Last week it was stainless steel. The week before that, I think it was an indigenous wicker woven bowl. And this week it is a wooden bowl. But all of them hold your contributions happily. So please think about that as you file out. And you might also have noticed there's a table here with some books on it. And they happen to be the most recent book of our speaker tonight. So you can avail yourselves of one of those if you'd like to on your way out. So let me tell you about the committee meeting. We voted in a new board member whom I'm happy to welcome and introduce tonight, Martin Phillips. If you want to raise your hand. I can tell he's a popular choice. He's been a wonderful contributor, and he's generally known as Aunt Miriam, the bookseller's wife, but he's gaining fame because he brought... He brought our second speaker of the series, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, which many of you attended and I think found very informative. The other thing that we did was the committee actually accepted my wish to step aside as of the end, don't make me get emotional, at the end of this season. And I think I've been serving as chair, if we want to call it that. We try to keep the titles very low profile for the last 12 or so years, on or off, so it's time. And the most exciting thing is that we have a wonderful new incoming chair in the form of Bruce Claflin. And Bruce, applause. Bruce has been a fantastic contributor to ideas for our forum and just a real energizer bunny, and he has tremendous vision. He won't take no for an answer. He's dogged in his persistence of pursuing the speakers that he thinks you all deserve. So I feel frankly very, very pleased about the succession plan. I feel very pleased about our new member, the composition of the committee, and I will take this moment to name our committee members start in alphabetical order. So Bruce Claflin, Helen Elkins, Leslie Glotzel, Nina Herrick, Gail Jackson, Martin Phillips, and Peter Rothschild. I think I've got 7 there. They are all strong contributors to ideas for and sponsorship of and obtaining the speakers that you hear. So I thank them, and applause for the committee, please. All right. We thank Helen and Bill Elkins for bringing tonight's speaker, Michael Mann, to the attention of the committee. Professor Mann is Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has several other titles that demonstrate his leadership as a significant contributor to the scientific understanding of historic climate change. He is also the recipient of numerous national and international awards that recognize his path-breaking research. One such award, the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement 2019, is often described as equivalent to a Nobel Prize in its distinction. He was elected to the National Academy of Science in 2020. He's the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed publications, as well as op-ed pieces and commentaries, and of 5 books. His 6th book is to be released in just 3 weeks, I believe, and it's entitled Science Under Siege, a most timely topic. If we are lucky, he will give us a sneak preview of that latest book. I'm sure we will be seeing and hearing him and his co-author on the TV and radio circuit in just a few weeks. But tonight, it is our good fortune to have him here in person, due in no small measure to the fact that his father, Larry Mann, is an Islesboro resident. So, Larry, do you want to raise your hand somewhere? There he is. There he is. I'll just offer as an aside that when I first reached out to Professor Mann, I was, I won't say blocked, but I had to jump over all sorts of gatekeeper hurdles to get to him, to ask him, invite him to speak, until I mentioned Islesboro. And in the blink of an eye, he personally was back to me to say that he'd be delighted to do it. But having all those gatekeepers is just an indication of the extent to which he is in heavy demand for speaking. So we're very fortunate to have him, and I'm going to ask him to come to the podium and take over. That's the man.
Well, thanks very much. I should mention, actually, that my father was brought to Islesboro by his friend Judy Gardner, who many of you may know. So it's great to have both of them in the audience here tonight, and my family, my wife Lorraine Santee and my daughter Megan Mann. I also want to thank the bookseller. As it turns out, the book I'm going to talk about is actually my 7th book. I spend way too much time writing books these days. But my last book, Our Fragile Moment, I actually gave a talk at the Historical Society a year ago about, and the bookseller was very kind to bring copies of that book, and I'll be happy to sign them for anybody who wants to get a copy. But today I'm going to talk about Science Under Siege. It's the title of my talk today. It's the title of my forthcoming book with my co-author Peter Hotez, who many of you may recognize. He is one of the foremost experts on vaccines and COVID-19, a public health scientist. Peter and I realized a couple years ago that we were dealing with many of the same sorts of challenges and attacks, and that it might be cathartic in some sense to work together to write a book about sort of our common experiences on the front lines of these different battles and what we can learn from them. We had no idea 2 years ago when we set out to write this book how sadly prophetic / relevant it would be by the time that it is set to come out a month from now. So let me start out by sort of describing the challenge that we face. And of course, as someone already pointed out to me in a conversation I had before we started, it isn't just science that's under siege, right? It's democracy today that's under siege. And the attack on science is sort of part and parcel to that larger challenge. And I will touch on that larger challenge. But when it comes to this specific topic of science and how it's under siege, Peter and I think of it as sort of a 1-2-3 punch. It's sort of it's a triple assault. The first, of course, deals with the issue that I focus on, the climate crisis. Every year now, we hear it's like Groundhog Day, if you've seen the film. Every year now is the warmest year on record. It seems like it's on repeat, that particular headline. So with every year, we set a new record for global warmth, and we are seeing the consequences of the warming of the planet. They're not subtle anymore. We see them in the form of unprecedented extreme weather events, wildfires, floods, superstorms. this is symptomatic of the warming of the planet. We would not be seeing such extreme and such frequent devastating weather events if not for the fact that we're warming up the planet. Just earlier this summer, my group and I published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where we demonstrated that there's a threefold increase over the past half century in a particular pattern, that sort of very wavy pattern that you often see in the jet stream associated with extreme weather events, those wildfires and floods and heat waves, that's often associated with a jet stream that is exaggerated in its waviness, and it becomes stationary. So those high and low pressure systems sit over the same location day after day. That's when we see the most damaging, the most deadly extreme weather events. And there's a tripling in the frequency of that sort of pattern. Why I'm emphasizing this is not captured well in the models that we use to project the future, to project the future impacts of climate change. So keep in mind that when you see these model projections and you hear scientists talk about the implications of what the models have to say, and you hear the models under attack by climate change critics, if anything, the models are probably underestimating some of the consequences of climate change that we're already seeing because they don't resolve some of these important sort of details about human-caused climate change. Those of you here in Maine are probably familiar with those coastal storms we call nor'easters. And also, earlier this summer, we published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where we demonstrated the most intense of these storms. And the most intense of these nor'easters, they have names, right? The perfect storm, of course, immortalized by the film of the same name, but you felt the consequences, you felt the impacts of the perfect storm here in Maine, the storm of the century in 1993, Snowmageddon, which I was actually snowed in. I was at Penn State University at the time, but I had been invited to the University of Pennsylvania, where I now teach, to give a talk. The talk was canceled. There was a blizzard that closed down the University of Pennsylvania for 3 days, and I was stuck in my hotel room in Rittenhouse Square. The interstates were closed down. That was Snowmageddon. And then the January 2018 blizzard. So the most intense of these nor'easters are becoming more intense. The upper end of the scale is increasing, and so that has obvious implications for New Englanders. It has obvious implications for those of you who live here in Maine. Just in May, there was a rare late season nor'easter, and we're going to see more intense nor'easters with bigger winds, bigger storm surges. That's a concern for an island that is becoming two islands. Bigger storm surges, more erosion, and obviously heavy snowfalls that come with that as well. So the impacts of climate change aren't subtle anymore. We're seeing them play out in real time, and no place is safe from the devastating, often deadly consequences of these impacts. And speaking of deadly, it brings us to the second of this 1, 2, 3 punch, which is deadly pandemics. We are seeing increasingly deadly pandemics. Obviously, we've just lived through the most profound example of that with COVID-19 over the past several years. But the reality is that climate change, ecosystem destruction, deforestation, all of these human impacts are working together synergistically to create the conditions for even more devastating and deadly pandemics. Finally, the third and the biggest punch in this triple whammy is anti-science disinformation. And it's part of the larger challenge of disinformation that we face today, but anti-science disinformation that makes it impossible for us to even address these challenges. And let me just talk briefly about one of the, an example that goes back decades. The assault on climate science goes back several decades as it became clear we were warming the planet through fossil fuel burning, and that was a threat to certain powerful vested interests who profit greatly from our reliance on fossil fuels. And so here's a graph from 1982 that accurately predicted the increase that we would see in carbon dioxide concentrations under business as usual burning of fossil fuels, which we basically followed, and the warming that would result. It was spot on. This wasn't me or any of my climate science colleagues or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or Al Gore. This was ExxonMobil. It was their own scientists who published a report, and they talked about the potentially catastrophic events that we would see if we continued on this course. As we all know, they published that report. They engaged in an effort to work with policymakers to move us away from fossil fuels towards cleaner. No, they didn't do any of those things. They did exactly the opposite. In fact, they spent billions of dollars, along with other fossil fuel companies, in the largest disinformation campaign in the history of human civilization to attack the science that their own scientists had secretly affirmed, and to forestall any meaningful action. And as a result of that, we are now seeing, and this is the wording that was used in this article, potentially catastrophic. It's right from the ExxonMobil report from 1982, and this is a headline from NBC News about Hurricane Milton, one of these Category 5 storms. We've seen a dramatic increase in the intensity of these storms. And so this is perhaps my favorite example, though, because this is exactly as I captured it on my computer screen. California, this was a few years ago, California facing drought crisis as water shortages mount and fire danger escalates, brought to you by ExxonMobil. Now that is truth in advertising. That's exactly as it appeared. Of course, you're supposed to click on that ExxonMobil banner, and then you'll link to their website where they'll tell you about all the things they're supposedly doing to address the crisis. But in fact, they and other fossil fuel companies have continued to lobby the U.S. government against taking any meaningful action to move away from fossil fuels. And as a result of that, this is where we stand today. If we had acted to bring our carbon emissions down 2.5 decades ago, we could have avoided a catastrophic 1.5 Celsius, 3 degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet, which we're coming very close to now. It would have been, I sometimes use a skiing analogy. I'm not a good skier. My wife and daughter are good skiers. This is a bunny slope. I can do a bunny slope, okay? Now what we have to do is a black double diamond slope. That's what we need to do now. We've got to bring carbon emissions down by 50% by 2030 now if we have any hope of keeping warming below that level. That is the cost of inaction. That is the opportunity cost of decades of disinformation. And it isn't just climate. We face the same sort of disinformation today regularly when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to vaccinations. And here's an example just the other day on social media. I talked to my wife about this. She's actually a cell biologist, and so if you've even taken high school biology, ninth grade biology, you know that every human cell contains mRNA. But there's this idea that these mRNA vaccines, they've got mRNA. This is a health risk. There's such misinformation. It would almost be comical if not for the fact that this sort of thinking is now embraced at the highest level of our government. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who you may have heard just recently is defunding all mRNA research. The COVID vaccines that came to our rescue during the COVID-19 epidemic were mRNA vaccines. This is an incredibly important development over the last 10 years that allows us to perhaps our most powerful tool in dealing with pandemics. And now the U.S. government is going to defund research in that area. And you may have seen this headline just yesterday. Police officer dead after anti-vax shooter targets CDC headquarters, blamed his illness on the COVID vaccine. So that is where we stand today. The deadly consequences of anti-science. I have seen this myself 2.5 decades ago when we published the now well-known hockey stick curve of showing how temperatures have warmed over the past century in a manner that's unprecedented, more than 1,000 years back in time, and it became sort of a symbol in the climate change debate, and I found myself subject to attacks, to death threats. I'm not the only one. My co-author, Peter Hotez, has been attacked by people like Steve Bannon. He's been called a criminal. We call this stochastic terrorism, because when these very prominent individuals make these sorts of accusations against you, then all sorts of people come out of the woodwork. Some of them may be unhinged, and so it is literally an act of terrorism. Elon Musk, my pronouns are prosecute Fauci. Tony Fauci, a good friend of ours. I think this cartoon sort of captures, I would say in an almost sardonic way, how those of us in climate science feel about what we see happening to our friends, to our colleagues in public health science today, because we were subject to this decades ago. The same exact tactics now are being used to discredit and attack public health scientists like Peter, like Tony Fauci. It's an article I wrote 5 years ago. Climate scientists feel your pain, Dr. Fauci. So the book is about these 5 forces that threaten our world. The first I'll talk about is plutocrats. We know who we're talking about. Elon Musk, who's weaponized Twitter, perhaps the most widely used by certain measures, social medium, and he has weaponized it for anti-science misinformation. Their algorithm actually tends to favor scientific misinformation about climate science, about COVID-19. And this article, describes him as a Bond villain. It's sort of metaphorical, a metaphorical description. But with Rupert Murdoch, who indeed has used his global media empire, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, New York Post, newspapers around the world, and TV news networks around the world. He's used his media empire, his massive media empire, to sow confusion and doubt and misinformation and disinformation about climate change. And he literally inspired a Bond villain. There is a Bond villain actually based on, at least partly, Rupert Murdoch. We see these connections. Rupert Murdoch has worked closely with the Saudi royal family. They have a common fossil fuel interest. The Murdoch media empire has been used to promote fossil fuels, to discredit climate science. He's collaborated closely with petrostate actors like Saudi Arabia. We'll get to the petrostates shortly. Then you've got folks like Tony Blair, former prime minister, Labour prime minister of the UK, godfather to Rupert Murdoch's daughter. Sort of interesting. I gave the first time I gave this talk was in the UK back in May. And the day before I gave the talk, one of the headlines that I read was Tony Blair coming out and saying phasing out fossil fuels is doomed to fail. We should rethink net zero policy. It was a little surprising. Why is Tony Blair? Well, the next day, just in time for my talk, to include in my talk, was this headline: Tony Blair unmasked as chief lobbyist for Saudi oil firm. Many of you may know this quote, Upton Sinclair: "It's difficult to get a man or woman or person to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." And that certainly applies here. The Koch brothers. That photo there on the left, I took when I was with my family. Went to the American Museum of Natural History, and I just think there's something so appropriate about there being a David H. Koch dinosaur wing on many levels, but not the least of which is that no individual has done more to bring us back to the CO2 levels that existed during the age of dinosaurs than David Koch and his brother, the Koch brothers. And in fact, they have been one of the primary funders of a whole network of front groups and organizations that seek to discredit climate science, that seek to block renewable energy, the expansion of renewable energy, and to incentivize fossil fuel energy. What most people don't realize is they have played an equal role in spreading COVID-19 disinformation. And to understand that, you have to understand sort of how things played out early on. The lockdowns that were required to deal with the pandemic early on were a threat to the Koch brothers. They were a threat to the use of fossil fuels in transportation and other parts of our economy. So lockdowns were a threat to their bottom line. And as a result, they decided to hijack, as this article says, the war on COVID. And from that point forward, because the Koch brothers were opposed, and other plutocrats that are part of that same network were opposed to the public health measures necessary to deal with that crisis, that became imprinted on the ideology of the right. It became part of the sort of cultural identity, and that is why anti-vax propaganda and COVID-19 misinformation is almost seamless now with climate misinformation in this sort of disinformative universe that dominates the right. David Koch, I should add, is a big proponent of geoengineering, the idea that we will shoot particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the sun. That's how we'll deal with climate change. We can continue to burn fossil fuels and increase carbon pollution in the atmosphere, but we'll do other things to the planet to try to offset that. What could possibly go wrong? There are lots of things that could go wrong. The principle of unintended consequences reigns supreme here, but perhaps most significantly is what we call moral hazard. To the extent that we believe these people, that there is some stopgap, there's some switch we can set down the road, it provides an excuse for the continued reliance and burning of fossil fuels. Well, this is sort of interesting. Spiked magazine is a Marxist, an ostensibly a Marxist magazine. And here's an article that was in defense of the geoengineering, of the dimming the sun. My Oxford colleague, Pierre Humbert, and I were attacked in that article by name as climate zealots for a commentary we had written in The Guardian, warning of the dangers of engaging in these sorts of geoengineering interventions. And it doesn't make sense until you realize that Spiked Network is actually funded by the Koch brothers. And so if any of you have seen the original film, The Manchurian Candidate, where it was, about the left sort of masquerading as the right, the political left. This is the reverse Manchurian Candidate. This is now the political right masquerading as the political left. And these are the sorts of underhanded tactics that are so omnipresent today. Just a little bit more about geoengineering. Not all of, the advocates of geoengineering, the people we might argue are wrong-headed in their approach to the problem. Not all of them are on the political right. Bill Gates is not on the political right, and he's a major proponent of geoengineering as a way to deal with the climate crisis. He downplays the role of renewable energy. He emphasizes nuclear energy and geoengineering and carbon capture, and often throws cold water, no pun intended, on renewable energy. So many of us feel he's quite wrong-headed. He's done a lot of important positive work when it comes to developing vaccines, the COVID-19 crisis. But in the climate space, he's played a problematic role. In fact, such a problematic role that if you saw the movie Don't Look Up, how many people here in the audience? A fair number of you. It was nominally about a comet that's going to strike the Earth, but it's really an allegory, it's a metaphor for the climate crisis. And the villain in that film is a tech bro, a tech lord we don't have to destroy the asteroid. We can use my technology to mine it for valuable ores and metals and gems, and just trust me. In fact, I know Adam McKay, the director, quite well, and I've confirmed in conversations that indeed this was sort of a metaphor for the sort of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musks of the world who think we can just sort of technify our way out of these problems. Now, the scientist in the film, played by Leo DiCaprio, just trying to articulate the science to the public and warn them about this problem. I mean, we have no idea what sort of bozo inspired that character. One can only imagine what sort of crazy academic could have inspired that. But especially, I would never wear a jacket like that. Anyways, the right path forward, is not engaging in unprecedented experiments with the one planet in the universe that we can live, that we know can support life. It's to stop burning fossil. It's not that hard. Stop burning fossil fuels. Yeah, thank you. It's not that hard, right? It's really not that hard. I've got a lot to get. I'm going to just sort of go through some of this. We've got petrostates, right? And I've already alluded to Saudi Arabia, Russia, economies that are fundamentally based on the extraction and sale of fossil fuels, and have done everything they can to scuttle international agreements aimed at dealing with the climate crisis, and have interfered, have used social media, bot armies, and troll farms to try to game social media in a way that that advocates that sort of that promotes that agenda, that disinformative agenda, and has had a willing accomplice in Elon Musk, for example, when it comes to Twitter. So I would argue Facebook and other social media sites as well. It's also important, a historical fact most people aren't aware of. Back during the Obama years, ExxonMobil had plans to form a partnership with Rosneft, the state fossil fuel company of Russia, that was worth half $500 billion, $500 billion oil deal. But it was blocked by the sanctions that were in place against Russia over their actions in the Ukraine. Now, I will just say that everything that we have seen happen since in international geopolitics involving the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, can be understood in those terms. And very few journalists, Rachel Maddow being one of the few who's actually dug down into that. She wrote a whole book that actually gets into that. And so under Trump, we ourselves are a petrostate that is collaborating with other petrostates. Just the other day, and we're talking about connections with Russia, well, our Department of Energy Secretary the other day announced that they would not only be writing reports that attack the science of climate change, and I'll get to that in a bit, but they're going to be going back to reports that were published under the Biden and Obama administrations and editing those reports to reflect their anti-science views about climate change. And that is literally, that's my quote, by the way, that The Guardian in their title, I said that's exactly what Stalin did for one reason. That's exactly what Stalin did. Back in the, if you read about the era of Lysenko and Stalinist Russia, they were literally jailing scientists whose findings didn't comport with their ideological views about agriculture and how evolution takes place. It turns out they adopted instead these crank views, the views of this crank scientist Lysenko, and they implemented those, and that actually led to dramatic blights and starvation, widespread starvation in Russia. It's sort of a canonical tale, example of the dangers that can result when, when politicians oppose science that they don't like for ideological reasons and promote science that they do like. And that's what we're seeing right now. There's no other way to describe it. And various politicians, all mostly on one side, exclusively really on one side of the aisle, the Republican Party, have been engaged in this assault on climate science and climate scientists for decades, and I myself have encountered their attacks. So have Peter Hotez and Tony Fauci encountered similar attacks now on the science of vaccines, on the science of public measures for dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, again, because of an ideological sort of purity test that now that now characterizes the way that one party, the Republican Party, approaches the issue. Some have even compared these attacks to the attacks against Galileo by the Catholic Church back in the 1600s. It's like we're going back to the 1600s, right? Back half a millennium. All right, pros. There are a lot of people who are employed as attack dogs. They are funded. You see them on talk radio or on cable television, or you read their op-eds in conservative newspapers. They're basically paid attack dogs who are working to discredit the science of climate change. I've encountered that. You have the same thing in the area of COVID-19 and epidemics. And in fact, there's something very interesting that happens in that space where you have individuals who attack sort of mainstream public health science, the efficacy and safety of vaccinations, and promote their own sort of miracle cures. And we're familiar with this in COVID-19. In the 2011 movie Contagion, if you've seen it, it's worth going back and watching it again. It's quite remarkable because sort of the antagonist in the film, played by the actor Jude Law, is actually one of these pros, one of these individuals who is trying to discredit the vaccine that's being developed to deal with this global deadly pandemic, and is selling his own cure and profiting from it. Quite prescient, really, given what we've seen now in sort of the health freedom movement that has really taken off in the era of COVID-19. So you got pros, you got propagandists. One we've been hearing a lot about lately, Steve Koonin, a nuclear physicist who likes to describe himself as he's a climate change denier. He's attacked the science of climate change in the Wall Street Journal and Fox News. He likes to call himself an Obama scientist. He's gotten a lot of mileage because he did once have an appointment in the Obama administration, and so he's been dining out on that for quite some time now. This is an Obama scientist who is telling you that climate science is bunk, but he's really more of a Tucker Carlson scientist, really, a Fox News scientist. And in fact, as of a week ago, he is a Donald Trump scientist. He is one of 5 scientists who wrote a report for the Department of Energy attacking the mainstream science of climate change. And it's just full of untruths, half-truths, cherry-picked graphs, and talking points that have been recycled for decades. In fact, I tweeted about it. The 1980s called. They want their discredited talking points back because that's sort of what we're seeing, just a recycling of discredited talking points. A lot of this is promoted on social media, anti-social media, we call it bots of war, troll farms, bot armies that are used to just massively scale up this misinformation and disinformation. And given the Given the algorithms that are in place right now on Twitter and other social media, they are dominating over actual science-based sources of information. They're just flooding the zone, and that's their tactic, flooding the zone. And at this point, we're not doing what's necessary to push back in any meaningful way. I'll skip past that example. I'll point out that it isn't just, I talked a lot about science deniers, science denial, climate change denial, anti-vaxxers. There's another very pernicious form of propagandist that has emerged in recent years in the climate space in particular. It's the doomers. Those who tell you, hey, it's too late to do anything. We have triggered runaway warming. The Arctic permafrost is melting. The methane is going to increase exponentially no matter what we do. People like Guy McPherson, who I think it was 11 years ago now, said that humans would be extinct within 10 years. So you can breathe a sigh of relief. And what that does, it's not supported by the science in any way. And what it does, that sort of doomism leads people to disengagement. If you really believe that we have no efficacy, that we have no agency, then why bother? And so in some ways, it's even more pernicious than outright denial because it takes the very people who would be on the front lines demanding change and leads them to the sidelines, right? It leads them from engagement to disengagement. And I'll come back to that point in a bit. Let's finally talk about the press. And of course, it would be easy for me to stand here and talk about the pernicious nature of the Murdoch media empire. I already did that, and Fox News. Obviously, conservative media is a major problem. They promote, they have an entire echo chamber of science denial and access to some of the most widely read and viewed media on the planet for that purpose. But there's another problem, and again, maybe in some ways even more pernicious, is what Peter and I refer to as performative neutrality that we see now in the part of the legacy media, the mainstream media. This idea that, hey, we have to be balanced. So, we'll have a NASA scientist talking about, the spherical Earth, and we'll have a flat Earth scientist, both on the stage because, right, these are equally valid views. That's sort of the approach that they take whenever there's any sort of controversy, whenever in that politically and ideologically motivated controversy. The idea is, well, we have to present both sides. And one could argue that this is a larger affliction in the way the media treats any number of topics today, but it certainly applies to the way that they treat topics like climate change or, vaccination and COVID-19 science, where there is a very motivated and very loud and very well-organized opposition that pumps their misinformation out there, and too often the legacy media just, will just throw our hands up and say, well, we'll just put both, ideas out there. And when you do that, of course, what you're doing, and I think about this as a Bayesian statistician sometimes. There's what's known as a prior. You start out with where do we think the weight of evidence is? And we start out with that, and then as we get new data, we sort of work towards a more refined estimate of things. So this is like having a prior where climate change is a 50-50 proposition. And you start out there, and the public and viewers start out with the assumption that this is a 50-50 proposition, and then the burden is on the scientist during the course of the debate or what have you to try to work back towards where the weight of evidence actually is, which is 99.9999 versus 0.0001. It's not 50-50. And so you've lost at the very start once you've framed this as a debate. And too often our mainstream media does that, or even worse. You have the New York Times, and you have, when it comes to climate science, when it comes to vaccines and this idea of the lab leak hypothesis, which is not supported by any science. If you talk to actual scientific experts, we now know we actually I'm trying to remember the term that I was going to look for here, but when it comes to sort of the origins of the COVID-19 virus, we have genetic markers that actually tell us the crossover events, the zoonotic crossover events from species to species. There's very detailed evidence of natural origins of this virus, and yet the New York Times and Washington Post are constantly hosting commentaries and op-eds by people insisting that, that the lab leak theory is a viable theory, and what's pernicious about it is it's used to undermine the authority of the scientific community. It's used to sow distrust in science and scientists. And the Washington Post and the New York Times have really played into that in a way that's very problematic, and we call them out for that in this book. It isn't just Fox News, it isn't just Rupert Murdoch. It's the New York Times and the Washington Post, in fact, and other legacy media that are often, in some ways, even more culpable because they know better. Why are they doing this? So the path forward, what is the path forward here? Talk about doomism. The science does not support a narrative of doomism. The science tells us, and there is overwhelming evidence from detailed modeling over the last decade or so that tells us that the warming of the planet stops when we bring carbon emissions to zero within a few days. So this idea that we've triggered runaway warming and it's too late to do anything about it is completely wrong. It implies a lack of efficacy. It implies a lack of agency when the science actually tells us that there's a direct and immediate consequence of our efforts to decarbonize our economy. So it's important to understand what the science actually says. Yes, we can still stop the worst effects of climate change if we act. Financial Times has done a lot of really good journalism on climate, and I was very disappointed a year ago or so, maybe more than a year now, when they put out this article, the title of which is completely wrong. The world is warming faster than scientists expected. And I tweeted out immediately, no, Financial Times, it isn't. The world is warming as fast as we predicted, and that's bad enough. And let me just magnify that. The black is the average over all of the models that the IPCC uses to project the future. That's the black curve. The blue is the range among all the models. Some models predict more warming than other models. They treat some of the physics differently. And the red, those are the observations. They are smack dab in the middle of the model spread and right on top of the model average. The planet is warming up as fast as we predicted. Now, some of the consequences of that warming are exceeding what we predicted. And I talked a little bit about that, the extreme weather events, the melting of ice sheets, and the collapse, in the beginning of the collapse of ice sheets and the contribution to sea level rise. Some of the consequences are exceeding what we predicted, but the models tell us that the warming is what we predicted it would be, and they tell us that if we stop burning fossil fuels and we bring carbon emissions to zero, the warming stops. And so that's really important. It's really important that people understand that the truth, as I like to say, is bad enough. And that's a major theme of my last book, which is over here, Our Fragile Moment. We don't have to exaggerate the case, the science, to make the case for urgent action. There's urgency, but there is agency as well. The antidote to doom, as I like to say, is doing. And that applies to climate, as I just talked about, but it has so much greater salience right now when it comes to everything that we're dealing with. It is a tactic of the bad actors out there who are trying to take the world, who are trying to destroy American democracy and take the world in a very dangerous direction. One of their tactics is doom and despair. They want you on the sidelines. They want to convince you that you have no efficacy. It's too late. There's no way that you can fight back against what they're doing. And so the antidote to that, the antidote to doom, is doing, is voting, is being out there, is speaking truth to power. This is not the time for fatalism, for certain. And yes, the United States disengaging right now when it comes to global climate negotiations. That's deeply problematic. But other countries like China are actually stepping up in their own efforts, recognizing the vacuum of leadership and the opportunity that gives them to sort of be the adult in the room. And there are all sorts of environmental organizations in the U.S. that you can be involved in, you can support, you can fund, that are working with our international partners to make sure that we make progress, even while the U.S. at the federal level is somewhat on the sidelines. And then hopefully when we return to sanity, if that happens, we will still have made enough progress globally that it's not too late to avert some of those dangerous thresholds that we're trying to avoid. This is that photo I promised of my daughter and a polar bear, and we're not torturing our daughter. This is from the Pittsburgh Zoo, where you can walk through a plexiglass tunnel, goes underneath the polar bear feeding pool. And if you're involved in an NSF-funded project to develop climate outreach materials for zoos and aquaria, and the manager of the zoo, you can convince him to throw the fish in the pool when your daughter is walking underneath, which is what's happening here when she was 6 years? That's 5 or 6 years old. But I mean, it's about a world. What sort of world do we want to leave behind for our children? And polar bears are symbolic, right? Because the absence of polar bears doesn't seem like, well, I've never seen one of these in the wild anyways. They're way off there in the Arctic. But it's about, the sort of wonder and beauty of a viable planet. There is a scenario where we continue on a path of exploitation and devastation, where we leave behind an essentially unlivable planet for future generations. But there's another future that's still possible. And it's up to us to do everything we can to make that future possible. And I'll leave it, and I was talking with one gentleman earlier, we were talking about Tolkien, and to me what we're living through right now is profoundly a Tolkien-esque sort of moment in time. And I draw inspiration from these sorts of tales. They may be mythical, but there are fundamental truths in them. And one of my favorite lines in that film, and it sort of summarizes, I guess, what I'm trying to argue here, is that there's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. And that is absolutely true for us today. And so I'll leave you with those words of inspiration. I'll be happy to field your questions. Thank you. Yes, please, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Mann. Thank you for your work over many decades. It's been a real inspiration
Thank
for
you.
me. A question, if you were to go back to your former self 2.5 decades ago in that hockey stick paper, and all that you know now about media and communication, what would you do differently?
Yeah, black hole research. No, plastics. No, I've been asked that question before, and often it's framed in terms of the sort of the arrows, of misfortune, the attacks that I have suffered over the years, death threats against me and my family, demands by, politicians for me to be defunded, for me to be fired. You name it. Every weapon in their arsenal has been deployed against me at some point, and so would you do things differently? Would you choose a different field? And my response is no. To me, there is nothing more satisfying than being in a position to influence a conversation about the greatest challenges and the greatest threats that we face as a civilization. I consider myself profoundly privileged to be in a position to do that, and I wouldn't change a thing. Despite everything. Thank you. Thank you. Back here?
This goes to your main point of your very cogent argument, but and it gets back to plain science. I guess developing science, and I'm talking about the concern about the overturning Atlantic currents and that effect on the climate.
Yeah.
And I've seen various takes on that.
Yeah.
What's yours?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there are a number of tipping points that we worry about. I've alluded to some of them. The collapse of the ice sheets, that's a tipping point. Once they go, you don't bring them back. We don't build an ice sheet over hundreds of years. It takes hundreds of thousands of years. So once they go, they're gone. The sea level rise that comes with that is baked in. That is true for potentially for other attributes of the climate system. We call these tipping elements, and one of them is variously called the meridional overturning circulation, the Atlantic AMOC or AMOC, the Atlantic conveyor belt circulation. It's sometimes equated with the Gulf Stream, but from a physical oceanography standpoint, they're not quite the same thing. This is a ribbon-like current that delivers warm waters to the North Atlantic and makes the parts of North America, Eastern North America, and Europe warmer than they would otherwise be. And there's evidence that we know from the past, we know from climate model simulations, as you melt the ice at high latitudes, floods into the North Atlantic Ocean. It freshens that water. Fresh water is lighter than cold water, than salty water rather, and so that makes that de-densifies, if you will, the water, and it inhibits the sinking motion that helps drive that current system. Now, climate models predict that we should see that happen over the next century. I was a co-author on an article in Nature Geoscience. The first author was my good friend and colleague Stefan Rahmstorff of the Potsdam Institute in Germany, where we demonstrated that that appears to be underway already. So something that we expected not to see for a century appears to be underway. We appear to be seeing a slowing of that ocean circulation pattern ahead of schedule. A reminder that uncertainty is not our friend. Some of the uncertainties, when somebody says, well, there's uncertainty of science, so we shouldn't act. Much of the uncertainty is playing out in a way that things are happening sooner than we expected. The warming of the planet, we got about right. The consequences of the warming, in some cases, seem to be proceeding faster. This may be one example. Now, you won't get the movie The Day After Tomorrow. That is a caricature of the science. Tornadoes won't destroy the Hollywood sign. Jake Gyllenhaal will not win an academic decathlon. None of these things are going to happen. But there is a sort of kernel of truth to that. We do see that warming. In fact, that happening. And in fact, one of the consequences of the somewhat complicated physical oceanography of the North Atlantic is that even though that is expected to lead to a cooling overall in a large part of the North Atlantic Ocean, and we're seeing that cooling already, we're seeing it take place, it actually can lead to a warming of the Gulf of Maine. And the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming places in the global ocean right now. And we believe part of that may be due to the effect of the slowdown of this conveyor belt. So the day after tomorrow is not a viable consequence of that scenario. But dramatic warming in the Gulf of Maine may be. The disruption of the sort of marine ecosystems of the North Atlantic that make that such a natural sort of biologically productive part of the world. The reason that we have such plentiful fish populations in the North Atlantic relates to the the delivery of nutrients to the surface that's tied to the convection that occurs in the ocean because of that current system. So there could be a whole lot of negative consequences. In fact, one of them is that sea level, and this has to do with complex oceanographic physics I won't get into, but as that ocean current system slows down, the sea level on the eastern side of the Atlantic actually comes up. And it's because there's a pressure gradient associated with that sloping of the sea level that helps maintain that current system. So if you lose the current system, you have to change the slope in a way that brings it up along the east coast of the U.S. You can get an extra foot of sea level rise along parts of the U.S. East Coast from that. So it is a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that uncertainty is not our friend and that some of these consequences, if anything, may be happening earlier. Question in the, yellow.
My question relates to, I'd like you to please apply your subtle rhetoric to answer the following question. The interaction between the well-known periodicity of our own sun. We've had 3 to 4 glacial epochs, approximately 12,500 years each. We believe that the axis of the Earth like a top when you spin it, will wobble. Now, I praise you're going down the street and pulling the fire alarm and saying there's heat here, bring the trucks. I praise your mission. I am not going after your mission. But what I am saying is, you are summarily dismissing large geotectonic forces that operate on an Earth that is 3.5 billion years old, and you're looking to a knothole on the bench of the Red Sox game when I had a ticket behind the first baseline for $100.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you want to answer that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Don't skirt it by saying it's not significant.
So we published an article a few months ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, actually explaining one of the outstanding puzzles about the glacial interglacial cycles. There's a 100,000-year periodicity in the ice ages over the last 700,000 to 800,000 years that is driven by changes in Earth orbital geometry interacting with the global carbon cycle. It's actually a pretty complicated, interrelated set of interactions, but it's sort of paced by what we call Milankovitch forcing, by periodicities, as you allude to, of timescales of roughly 20,000 years, 40,000 years, and the dominant appears to be the 100,000-year eccentricity cycle. The Earth's orbit around the sun changes from, it's elliptical, it's not circular, but it changes in how elliptical it is on a timescale of about 100,000 years. And the puzzle for so many years, and my PhD advisor, Barry Saltzman, decades ago, was working on this very problem of trying to understand why we see a switch in the dominant periodicity of roughly 20 to 40,000 years associated with what we call obliquity and precession to this 100,000-year eccentricity dominant behavior at about 700,000, 800,000 years ago. It's known as the mid-Pleistocene transition, and climate models were unable to reproduce that. So a viable criticism, and I think sort of where you're going, would be, well, if this is such an obvious feature in the geological record, and if the models can't reproduce it, then why should we trust them for any of the other predictions they make? And one of the what we were able to show, and it was based on work that had been done, related work that had been done just a couple years earlier, what was missing from the models was the geology. It has to do with what's known as regolith. It's the unconsolidated sediment, and it's scraped away each time there's a glacial expansion. And over time, more of it gets scraped away, and eventually you have none of that sediment left. And so the ice tends to stay affixed to the ground because it can't slide over that unconsolidated sediment. And you can build larger ice sheets. And when you build larger ice sheets, you change the whole dynamics of the system, and it responds more to that 100,000 year. So absolutely, these sorts of, the past provides us all sorts of important tests for our understanding of the mechanisms that drive the climate today. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. Question right here. Yeah, please.
So this whole sense of doom is overwhelming with all the, all the things you hear in the news, and it comes like, what can I do? So you're a thing that we need to do but what do we do? It's just like there's so much that we need to do. So what would you, maybe I can't afford to go out and change to a electronic vehicle or whatever, right? An e-car or whatever.
Yeah.
But what are some things, or what one thing would you suggest that people start?
Thanks for that question. It's sort of another, it's another one of my sort of pet issues, is sort of the distinction between individual behavior and collective behavior. Like, how do we solve this problem? And you don't want to get me going on this. There have been some of those bad actors that I talk about have spent a lot of time trying to convince you that the problem is your carbon footprint. It's your carbon footprint. BP, back in the early 2000s, British Petroleum, gave us the first widely used individual carbon footprint calculator, because BP and the fossil fuel companies wanted you hyper-focused on your individual carbon footprint, so you didn't notice that 70% of the global carbon emissions come from just 100 fossil fuel companies. And so there's been this effort to sort of focus it on individual behavior to take the pressure off of systemic change, because we operate within a system, and we're limited, especially those of lesser means are limited more than those of greater means in terms of what we can actually do. Buying a electric vehicle, switching to a power plant, wind, solar, renewables is often more expensive because we have the wrong incentives right now. So we've got to change the incentives, and that can only be done by politicians, by policymakers. So the most important thing that we can do is participate in collective action, work together in the form of voting, in the form of speaking out, in the form of, doing everything you can to try to influence the prevailing politics around these issues. And there's so much that we can do today, especially because we have access to social media. Everybody's got this sort of instantaneous voice, and we can be out there opposing the misinformation and disinformation I talked about. We can be out there trying to bring people together to get positive information to them. And there's no one size fits all. Everybody has their own unique set of sort of skills and talents and proclivities. And so it's about figuring out what it is. Maybe you're an artist. Maybe what is it that you can bring to the table that plays uniquely to your strengths and your interests and helps us move collectively in this direction that we need to go. That would be my, very good, thank you. See, there's one question back there in the very back with, yes, you, please. No, yeah.
Thanks. I have somewhat of a philosophical question. Dissent, debate, lack of respect for authority, those are great American traditions. So setting aside COVID and climate, which I think are toxic discussions, what's your perspective on the role of dissent and debate and questioning and criticism in science?
Yeah, so thanks for that. It's interesting because it's one of those. Carl Sagan writes so eloquently about skepticism as an important sort of self-correcting mechanism in science. Richard Feynman, spoke eloquently about, and so what's happened is there's some, and I talk about bad actors, like trying to skew things, and there are some bad actors who've weaponized what is actually a positive thing in science, that self-correcting machinery, skepticism, and they've tried to equate it with contrarianism or denialism. They're not the same thing. Dismissing, the consensus of the world's scientists based on the flimsiest of arguments that may fool some people who don't know better, but doesn't stand up to the slightest bit of actual scientific scrutiny by experts. That's not skepticism. That's denialism, it's contrarianism. And so we have to distinguish, we have to do the best job that we can as scientists and communicators in distinguishing between those things, because true skepticism is a very valuable thing in science, and we have to reclaim the rightful role of skepticism in this conversation. As I've alluded to before, uncertainty, it's another one of those things. We shouldn't be afraid to talk about uncertainty. The contrarians, the science deniers, love to cite uncertainty as a reason for inaction. But uncertainty, as I've tried to convey to you in the climate arena today, is actually a reason for even more concerted action because of the very real possibility that things will be worse than we have predicted. And the cost of inaction in that scenario is far greater than the cost. In fact, even the fact that we talk about clean energy, we've allowed certain protagonists in the sort of in the economics sphere to frame clean energy as a cost, like moving towards clean energy is a cost, but somehow new fossil fuel infrastructure is an investment. Have you ever wondered why one is an investment and the other is a cost? We see the language often gamed in a way that, again, skews the discussion. So Uncertainty. We should embrace uncertainty and talk about its true implications. Skepticism. We should absolutely embrace skepticism because that's what drives science forward. I talked about this ice age problem. A gentleman asked about the ice ages, and actually that was a good example of where some scientists were skeptical of the idea that the problem had to do with the way we were treating some complex mechanisms involving ice dynamics or the carbon cycle. And it turns out the problem was actually we didn't have the geology in there. And getting the geology, it was something as simple as getting the geology. Sometimes it's an outsider. It's like a geologist coming into the problem and say, well, you know, and that's why departmental seminars are so important, because you'll have a geologist who come in and say, well, did you guys think about like the regolith and, you know, the role that might be playing? And that's skepticism. That's constructive skepticism. That's the give and take that helps move science forward. So yes, absolutely, we have to embrace it, and we have to reframe the conversation in a way that puts skepticism and uncertainty in its rightful role in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mann. And before we depart, but I do want to say, it's obvious that this man knows his subject. It's also obvious that climate change is perhaps the most complex public policy issue the world has ever faced. It is so interdisciplinary and requires so many areas of science to address. So it's a huge, huge challenge for all of us. But thank you all for taking it on this evening, and we thank Professor Mann for elucidating it in the way he has. It always pains me to cut off questions when I can sense there's an appetite for more. I hope you will have a chance to get another bite of the apple when he's over with the books. We look forward to seeing you next week, and thank you for coming tonight.